Hello students, Dell here. This week we are going to talk about the wonderful world of color in your remote learning. This is not a topic that you will deal with immediately this week, but it is going to be very important for what you do in class next week. So color is one of our elements of art and design, the things that we can physically put down on a piece of paper, build into a sculpture, what have you, in order to make artworks. Although color is one of these essential elements, it is quite a complex topic. In fact, we have an entire class here at NAU that is dedicated just to color theory. We are not going to go that much into depth in this class, but we do need to understand the basics, and in order to do that, we typically break down color into a few properties. In fact, there are three fundamental properties by which color is typically characterized. You see them here on the screen. You have hue, you have value, and you have chroma. We're going to talk briefly about what each one of these things means. So first up is hue. Hue is the attribute by which color is discernible. Now that's just a really complex way of saying it's how we tell one color from another. Hue is dependent upon a color's wavelength. Now this is kind of sciencey, but it is important to understand where hue is coming from. So what happens is that we see color because of light. If you're sitting in a totally dark room, you don't see any colors. You don't see much of anything at all. But when you have light, this light can be broken down into different colors that have wave-like properties. Our eyes specifically are sensitive to light in a wavelength range from about 400 to 700 nanometers. Those are really teeny tiny waves. If you look at the graphic here, you see that a nanometer is actually 100,000 times smaller than a strand of hair. When you combine all the wavelengths that we as human beings can see, everything from 400 to 700 nanometers, this makes up white light, like the light that falls from the sun. But if you split that light apart, split the white light into individual wavelengths, each one of those wavelengths corresponds to one of the many hues that we can see. We call this the visible spectrum. The basic hues of the visible spectrum are typically remembered by an acronym known as Roy G. Biv. This means red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. These are the colors of the rainbow, which incidentally, not that you need to know this for this art class, but a rainbow is created when you have white light that gets scattered apart into the spectrum by water droplets in the air. Every hue on the spectrum, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet, and everything in between, it corresponds to a specific wavelength. Red is the longest wavelength, while violet is the shortest wavelength. So, how this all relates to color that we see as artists, what happens when color comes out of the sun or out of a lamp in your room, it hits certain objects and those objects suck in some of the wavelengths and they bounce other wavelengths back into your eye. Whatever visible light a particular object reflects, that's what color it appears to have. So if you look at this graphic here, we have a black billiard ball on the left. When white light comes down, it sucks in all the white light, reflects nothing back to you, you see black. The red billiard ball in the center, it sucks in everything but the red wavelengths, bounces those red wavelengths back to you, you see red, and so on and so forth. All this, like I said, is a lot of science, and you don't necessarily need to remember it for this class, but as artists, you should know a little bit about what the heck color is and why we see it. But when we really get down to it, the thing you most need to know is that we can think of hue not so much in terms of wavelengths and all this fancy stuff, but just as the name of a color. So hue is determined by the wavelength, but it's described by name. So let's get into that a little bit. Let's talk about some specific hues that are important for you as an art student. First and foremost, I bet you've talked about this at some time in your past, primary colors. Primary colors are colors that cannot be created from any other combination of colors. They have to start out as the color that they are. There are actually several systems of primaries out there, but what we care about in a physical art class like this one is color that is based on pigment, so color that's based on physical stuff that we can touch. And in that kind of color system, the primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. In theory, primary colors can be mixed to create any other color. So when you mix any two primaries together, you create what's called a secondary color. For pigment primaries, the secondary colors are what you see on the screen here. So if you want orange, you're going to mix red and yellow. If you want green, you're going to mix yellow and blue. And if you want violet, you're going to mix blue and red. This is really important for when you're adding colors to your artwork to know what these mixes are. So you might want to screenshot this or write it down. There are also something called tertiary colors. So a tertiary color, or kind of a third tier color, is a color that you can mix with a primary color and a secondary color that has that first primary in it. So for example, if you mix blue plus green, remember green is blue and yellow, you're going to get a third color that's kind of in between the two, and we name these tertiary colors by the primary secondary mix. In this convention, the primary name comes first. So if you mix blue and green, you'd have blue green. If you mixed red and orange, you'd have red orange, and so on and so forth. Now this is all a lot, right? So artists and art theorists have come up with a way to visualize this, because we are all visual people. So what they do is they take primary, secondary, and tertiary hues and they organize them on this circle, which I'm sure you all know is called the color wheel. The color wheel is really great for allowing us to visualize relationships between different kinds of hues or different kinds of named colors. And this all brings us back to, again, hue. When we talk about primary, secondary, and tertiary colors, the first thing that we mention is what hue are they? So in everyday conversation, sometimes we give colors more fancy hue names than blue or green, or even something like blue-green. Sometimes we say things like cobalt or teal or aquamarine. You could give a color any name in your imagination in everyday conversation. But in art class, we always want to talk about colors in terms of the actual hue names, sort of the primary, secondary, tertiary names whenever possible. All right, so what this all means practically, what hue means practically, is that you as an artist really are better served if you can get in the habit of seeing the colors around you in terms of their underlying hues. Sometimes that's easy. You can look at something and say, yeah, that's red or that's blue, but it becomes a little more complicated when things appear to be kind of neutral. So it's worth practicing, seeing something that looks brown or gray or some other color that's not on the color wheel, and seeing if you can relate it to a color on the color wheel. So let's practice that for a moment. Here we have a brown tree on a brown lawn, and we have a tendency to want to just say, yeah, that's brown. But as artists, we do need to try to fit it on that color wheel, those primaries, secondaries, and tertiaries. Brown is not one of those colors. So see if you can see what colors might underlay this. If I look at the ground, for example, that could be considered a pretty dull orange. Likewise, on the tree, there are parts of it that are a little bit more reddish or a little bit more violet or a little bit more greenish. So you want to try to see that actual color wheel hue that underlies color. I'm going to throw up another example. We would probably describe this scene in everyday conversation as just being white. But again, white is not one of the colors on the color wheel. We're talking about red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet, and then the in-between colors, the tertiary colors. So you want to try to find one of those that things closely match. Okay, so that's hue, the name of the color. We're also going to talk about the second property of color, and that is value. Some of you have talked about value before in classes. I'm just going to give an overview because we will talk about this more on other projects. But it is the second fundamental property of color, and value just refers to the degree of lightness or darkness of a color, regardless of what hue it is. So you can have light blue or dark blue, for example. You can think about value kind of like how color would look if it was in a black and white photograph. Value is an element of art in its own right, which is why we'll talk about it more on other projects. And it does really help us establish a strong composition in our artwork. But for now, we just want to understand that it does play a part in color when we're looking at color properties. The third and final property of color is chroma. So chroma, again, third fundamental property of color. Chroma is actually the Greek word for color, but in contemporary usage, it just means the property of color indicating the purity or intensity of that color. In other words, the color has more of the pure hue present. In the screen here, you see a really bright, intense red on the left-hand side and a progressively duller red as you go to the right. So we would say the red on the left has higher chroma and the red on the right has less chroma. Again, back to the science. In scientific terms, a higher chroma color just is exclusively the wavelength of a given hue. So it's all, in the case of red, those 700 nanometer wavelengths, whereas a low chroma color has other wavelengths mixed in. It's gotten kind of dirtied by little bits of other wavelengths. Chroma is also sometimes described as the perceived strength or colorfulness of a color. So if you're asking how strong is that red or how strong is that blue, you are talking about the chroma. Now, what's important for us practically as artists is that we need to be able to control the chroma or the intensity of the color that we're putting into our artworks. It's really a fundamental skill. So for physical pigment-based systems, which is what we're dealing with in this class, the control we can most easily exert is to cut the chroma of a color, to reduce the chroma, in other words. So there's 3 methods that I'm just going to overview for you, and then we will be applying these in class as needed. But the first method for reducing the chroma is to add the complementary color. So we'll talk about this more in a minute, but the complementary color is the color that is across the color wheel from something. So it's the opposite color. It's usually, well, not usually, it is always a primary and then the secondary that's mixed from the 2 other primaries. So you see on the screen red and then green, which is mixed from blue and yellow. So complementaries are opposite one another. If you add a little bit of the opposite into a color, it will dull it down and reduce the chroma. It may also affect the value and darken things down, so that's something that's worth being aware. The second method for reducing chroma is to add either white, gray, or black, so to add a neutral in there. This creates respectively a tint, a tone, or shade. So add white and you create a tint, add gray and you create a tone, add black and you create a shade. These can affect the value, so white will make something lighter, a black will make something darker, a gray won't necessarily influence it one way or the other, but it's a good thing to be aware of what these terms are, even though we won't necessarily use them that much in this class. And the third and final way to reduce the chroma or intensity of a color is if you have multiple tubes of something in the same hue family. So you see on the screen here a really bright like cadmium yellow, and then off to the left sort of a duller yellow. You can add a little bit of dull yellow into a brighter yellow and just de-intensify it a little bit. Increasing chroma is not as easy as decreasing it. And I just want to point this out because sometimes people really want like a super bright color on their artwork, and so they're trying to mix things together to get it. But the highest chroma you're ever going to have is right out of the tube or right out of the box. You're never going to get a more intense color by mixing. So it's just worth being aware of that fact. All right, so that is the basic color theory, but we are just going to overview something that will be practical for us in this class, and that is the use of color schemes. So of course, you as an artist are always pretty free to use color how you want, but there are certain systems of putting colors together that have proven to be pretty effective, and I want to talk about those. So, as one of the formal elements, color does affect the formal principles of art and design. In other words, it's a compositional tool. How you put down color on whatever it is you're making affects how it looks and how the viewer understands what it is that you've made. Color also actually has an enormous impact on emotional content, perhaps of any of the elements of art and design. It is the one that most grabs people and sort of brings out certain emotions or memories or something like that in them. We're not going to talk too much about the symbolism of color yet, but just be aware that it is really powerful that way. Since color significantly affects both composition and meaning, it is really important when you're making art to consider your color layout before you start it, to have some idea of where you want to go with the color in a piece. So color schemes can help you do that. Again, you can use color pretty much however you want to as an artist, but these common color schemes or color harmonies are known to affect viewers in predictable ways, so you can take advantage of them to help create the effect or the meaning that you want in your artwork. We're going to go over each one of these and you'll see some examples. We've got achromatic, monochromatic, analogous, contemporary, triadic, tetradic, and warm and cool. First up is an achromatic color scheme. An achromatic color scheme just means a color scheme without color. So, in other words, blacks, whites, and grays. Achromatic color schemes can be really, really dramatic because it is all about these values and sometimes these extremes of white and dark. But you do need to worry about including enough variety in the different lights, darks, and grays that you have in there in order to hold your viewers' interest, because it can be kind of boring otherwise. Monochromatic is sort of similar to achromatic, but instead of just black and white, you can have variations of one color. There could be lighter versions of the color, darker versions of that color, tints, tones, and shades. There could be slightly different color casts to the color, but at its essence, it's variations of one color. As with achromatic, monochromatic color schemes are inherently unified, but they too can lack variety, so you need to make sure that you build that in other ways. Analogous color schemes are color schemes that use two or more colors that are adjacent on the color wheel. So things that are next to each other, like orange and red, or blue and green, or even three colors. You could go like violet, blue, and red, or something like that. But they're things that are next to each other on the color wheel. Analogous color schemes like monochromatic and achromatic are inherently unified. They often feel comfortable. They might even feel kind of serene. However, like the previous ones we talked about, they can lack variety. So it's always a good idea with analogous color schemes to make one color more dominant than the others. Next up is something quite a bit different, a complementary color scheme. We already mentioned that complementary colors are opposite one another on the color wheel. And so when you put these opposites together, they are really vibrant and have a lot of energy to them. They are opposites, but this contrast can also, in addition to being energetic, it can be kind of overwhelming. So again, it's a good idea to make one color more dominant. Next up, we have a triadic color scheme. Triadic color schemes use three colors that are spaced equally distant on the color wheel. Most famous triads are primaries and secondaries, and you can see them kind of laid out here on the right-hand side of the screen. Triadic color is inherently balanced because it comes from a triangle. It samples from around the color wheel. It feels very stable, but because, again, it is all over the color wheel, it can potentially lack some unity. So once more, it's very smart to make one color more dominant than the other colors. Tetradic color schemes use four colors. These are spaced either along a square or a rectangle on the color wheel. On the right-hand side here, you can see some examples of tetradic quads. I have to be honest, I very rarely use this kind of color scheme, and the reason is, again, it's balanced because it samples from around the color wheel, but this is perhaps the most difficult scheme to make unified, and I always feel like when I make art with this, it feels all over the place. But that doesn't mean that you wouldn't be able to use it successfully if you so desired. And then finally, I just want to talk about warm and cool colors for a moment. So colors on the orange half of the color wheel, that is to say yellow, orange, and red, are typically perceived as warm. They're fire-like colors. Colors on the blue half of the color wheel, so green, blue, and violet, these are perceived as cool. They're like ice. The warm versus cool, they give us very distinct feelings of warmth or coolness, and you can use that to your advantage. Color schemes that use warm versus cool are balanced because they do sample from either side of the color wheel. They're also extremely flexible because you can combine them with other types of color schemes like complementary or tetradic. You can also use them just in certain areas of a composition. Oftentimes we have a light source that is cool and then a shadow that's warm, or a light source that's warm and a shadow that's cool. So it is a very, very powerful way to think about color in terms of warms and cools. All right, so that was a lot of color theory, but I want to dive into specifically how color is used for us in 3D design. So when people think of color in art, they usually think of painting, but the element of color can actually be quite powerful in sculpture as well. As one of the elements of art, as I said earlier, color can be used to affect composition through principles like the ones we've talked about so far in this class, like variety, unity, and balance. We've discussed variety in this class. Just in case you don't remember, variety in art, it's one of our principles of art, and it is achieved when things like lines, shapes, colors, and the other elements of art are put together in ways where there are differences or contrasts from one another. Variety is really important in art because it's what helps create visual interest. It gives enough different things going on that your viewer has lots to look at and remains entertained by your work. Color is one of the most obvious ways to add variety or contrast. So you see the famous cherry on the spoon from the Minneapolis Walker Art Center, and that red cherry just pops in contrast to the black stem and the white spoon and adds so much visual interest. We've also discussed unity in this class. So again, if you don't remember, it's one of our principles of art, and it's the sense of wholeness or harmony in an artwork. Unity occurs when we build relationships between one part of an art piece and another, and this is most commonly done through a repetition of elements. Color is one of those elements that's really well suited to this. So if you repeat similar colors in different parts of an artwork, say you have some red on the right, then you maybe have a little bit of red on the left too. This is one of the most powerful ways to tie everything harmoniously together in your artwork. So you see on the screen all of these individual monitors, but each one has this kind of butter yellow color on it, and it ties the entire installation together. And finally, for our current project, Project 2, we are considering visual balance. Color can really powerfully affect balance. We talked last week about how different ways to create visual weight. So a bright or intense color tends to have more visual weight or more visual pull to it. By contrast, something that's dull or plain will have less visual weight. And by mixing these up within your composition, you can affect the visual balance. Even if you have asymmetry in terms of how things are placed, you can still make the overall weight feel even side to side through how you place color. Any of the color schemes that we discussed earlier can actually be applied to sculpture to help create compositional variety, unity, and balance. So let's look at some examples. Here you see an achromatic sculpture. Remember, this is inherently unified because it's all, just blacks, whites, and grays. It tends to be balanced because, again, a limited palette. But we have to be careful with achromatic color schemes that we have enough variety added in through other elements, through lines, through shapes, through spaces, and so forth. We can also have a monochromatic color scheme, again, inherently unified, inherently balanced, but some variety may need to be added through other kinds of elements. We have analogous color schemes that can be applied to sculpture. Analogous color schemes, too, are pretty unified. They're balanced because they're limited on the color wheel, but variety may need to be added through, again, other kinds of elements. We can have complementary color schemes in our sculpture. So these have the variety built into them because they're opposite of one another on the color wheel, but we may need to work with other kinds of elements to create unity and balance. Triadic color schemes definitely can be used in three-dimensional art and design. Again, they come from equidistant parts of the color wheel, so they're inherently balanced. And they have variety because they're from all over that color wheel, but we may need to work on the unity if we use a triad. Tetradic, again, inherently balanced. They have variety. It's 4 different colors on the color wheel, automatic variety, but we may need to add that unity in through lines, shapes, forms, etc., etc. And then finally, warm cool. This is the one that sort of intersects with other types of color schemes as well, but it is balanced. We have warm versus cool. It has variety, and again, the unity may need to be added in through other elements. All right, last but not least, and perhaps most helpful for you all, you can use any of the following media to color or finish the surface of your Project 2 sculpture. We are obviously not ready to do this yet, but I just want you to be prepared for next week. Generally speaking, with cardboard, any medium that does not overly wet the surface of the cardboard will work to add color. That means you're probably not going to want to slop on really wet watercolor, but most other kinds of paint, if painted on relatively dry, will work. So you see a list here of things that will be successful, most of which are available in the classroom. We have acrylic paint. We have ink in both black and colors. We have shoe polish, which actually makes a really nice surface. We have that in black and brown. We have a limited supply of textured spray paint that kind of has a sand-like texture and relatively muted color to it. You can actually make really nice surfaces by using just white glue brushed onto the surface or spray glue sprayed onto the surface and then dusting on sand or kitchen spices, all kinds of different things that you could use with a layer of glue on the surface. The glue itself we have in the classroom, the other things you'd be on your own for. You can use shellac or clear sealant if you want to keep the cardboard color and just deepen it a little bit. We have that available in the classroom. And finally, you're welcome to use custom materials such as tempera paint, gouache, marker, spray paint, pastel, anything like that you have to provide. But folks in the past have done some very cool things with other materials that they had on hand. All right. Obviously, we are not ready to start coloring our sculptures yet. We're still building the structures. However, start thinking about it now. What might you like to do with your surface? Finally, as part of the remote learning for this week, I put together a PDF of some student examples. This shows images of the sculptures the students made for Project 2, as well as some notes on what they used to color the surface, if anything, what color scheme they used, and so forth. It can be a great place to look for inspiration.